Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade.
We chronicled the distinct memories of our childhood in our book, While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s, which takes you on a notably historic journey through that often forgotten decade. We also want to hear about your experiences during the 1950s. We will feature guests whose special stories of that decade will bring to mind magical moments of reflection, some with tears, some with smiles, but above all, a good dose of laughter.
We would like you to chat with us as we bring to mind the sights and sounds so familiar to that time in history. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, friends. Happy New Year. My goodness, we are into this new year already, and it just breezes on by us, that's for sure. But it's chilly and bustling and bristly and blizzardy in some parts of the country. But with our guest today, I think you will find that she is not in that kind of climate. But before we get started today, we welcome you to our 1950s Fun Chat, and so look forward to having you be a continual visitor to our Fun Chats. And Jackie, how can they go about doing that?
Well, I'll first of all ask you, welcome all, and I'll ask you to peruse your screen, please. Note the purple banner on the bottom. It is our website that is listed there. It's www.whilethewindmillwatch.com. And if you go there, you'll find out more information about the book, about the authors, where the book is being sold, and then you'll also be able to see all the fun chats that we have recorded. In the upper right-hand corner, you just click 1950s Fun Chat. Okay, look at the screen. At the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see a beautiful North Dakota sunset, and it wraps around our book, While the Windmill Watched. You'll also notice a little white spot in the lower right-hand corner. Our book was published in April 2021. April 2022, this year, it received an award, the National Independent Press Award in the regional nonfiction category as the distinguished favorite. So we are very pleased to have that little white insignia, the label, the medal, the award mentioned on the front of the book. Alrighty, so let's get going here. We have a lovely guest this morning with us, or this afternoon. We're going to talk with Christobel Selecky. Christobel Selecky was born in 1955 and grew up in a little village called Arden, just north of the city of Wilmington, Delaware. Now, Arden was founded, this is a little history for you history buffs, Arden was founded in 1900 as a single tax community based on the economic philosophy of Henry George, and as it is on the National Register of Historic Places. It was an idyllic place to grow up, as it was filled with artists and craftspeople, surrounded by forests and dotted by village greens, or sometimes called common areas. After attending a Quaker school for 12 years of primary and secondary education, where her teacher, Joe Biden's sister Valerie, inspired her to become a political science major. Chris attended the University of Delaware and earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and philosophy. She then moved to Syracuse University to earn a master's degree in public communications from the Newhouse School, which, by the way, is one of the best journalism programs in the country. Her mother's work as a radio journalist inspired her to do that. Well, after living in Massachusetts for a brief time, she moved to Laguna Beach in Southern California. Christobel is married to John Selecky. That union brought 2 sons into her family, which has resulted in 3 grandchildren. Chris, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All righty. Let's begin by hearing of a time preceding the decade of the 1950s by asking you to give us some background on your parents.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know this is a show about the 50s, and I was only born in 1955, so But I do have a very interesting, I think, a very interesting history. My mother was a Holocaust refugee. So she her father was Jewish, and he converted to becoming a Catholic to marry my grandmother. And, as a half Jewish person, even though my mother was raised Catholic, when Hitler came into power by annexing Austria, and my mother was born in Vienna, Austria, she wasn't able to pursue her dream career, which was to be a singer and a performer. She was classically trained as a singer, and wanted to be a performer. And so she left. She picked up and left at age 26. Left her parents and her sister in Vienna, and unfortunately, it was a very tough time. Although fortunately, they survived the war. My great aunt, my grandfather's sister, did not. And my mother ended up in Miami because at that time, when you immigrated, you had to have a sponsor in the United States to bring you over, and they knew somebody in Miami. So she ended up in Miami and started her singing career there, and then moved to New York, and had an extremely interesting life after that. She met my father, who my mother was singing at Grossinger's, if you know where that was, one of the Borscht Belt. One of the Borscht Belt, resorts in the Catskill Mountains, and she was singing there. And my father was a public relations guy, so both of my parents sort of had, a little bit of the communications thing, which is, I guess, doubly what inspired me to pursue the degree that I pursued. And he was doing public relations for Grossinger's, and they met there and got married, and I was born several years after that. My father, though, was an 11th generation Yankee who had moved to New York City from Vermont, where his family, all those generations lived. And his ancestor, who first came to America, came in 1620 from a little village called Finchingfield, England. And so I'm first generation on one side and 12th generation American on the other side, which made for a very interesting kind of, double upbringing in very sort of classic American and very Austrian.
Chris, how have you found that coming from that communications background had really inspired you to go into that profession?
Yeah, I'm actually not. I'm more in business than I am in communications. I started my career in healthcare. I wasn't planning on being in healthcare, but I was recruited into a healthcare company really to help the founder write and communicate. And so, I ended up really staying in healthcare my whole career, and ending up being an executive and a CEO. And now I serve on corporate boards of directors, primarily in healthcare companies. And what I found really was that, management is just all about communication, right? It's about making sure that you have a vision and that you communicate that vision and that people understand it. And business writing is very important. And so, the lessons that I learned in studying journalism, how to write, how to communicate, how to tell a story, has always served me very well in terms of, doing the kind of work that I do.
I'd like to go back to your mother, please, and the information you shared with us, and jump in and talk about whatever hits your head here. But this is what I'm specifically interested in. We noticed that there are several nationally recognizable names in the information that you gave us. So please tell us about your godmother and how your mother met her.
Yeah. So my middle name is Eleanor, and it's Eleanor for a reason. I mentioned that my mother had come to Miami, her first stop in America in 1939, by the way. And she was sitting on the beach one day before she went off to sing she was singing in the Fontainebleau Hotel. And she met this very nice looking man on the beach, and they struck up a conversation. And in that conversation, she told him about her history and, why she had come to America, and the fact that she, still had family back in Vienna that were, living under the Hitler regime. And he said, I think my boss would be very interested in hearing that story. And she said, oh, that's interesting. Who's your boss? And he said, well, my boss is Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt. He happened to be the bodyguard of Eleanor, and he was there on vacation. And, he and my mother struck up a relationship, and he was going back to New York, and he said, would you like to, my mother's like, well, I really want to go to New York. That's where I can, go beyond Broadway and be a star and whatever. And so he drove her to New York and said, I'd love to introduce you to Mrs. Roosevelt. And you may know the Roosevelts, not only were living in the White House in Washington, but they also had, homes in New York, and both in Hyde Park, New York, and also in New York City. And so he introduced my mother to Eleanor, and they struck up a friendship. And Eleanor, she was sort of Franklin's eyes and ears, they always say. Sure. And she was always looking, to learn about what was going on in the world, and took a great interest in my mother's family. And actually, one time she went to Europe and visited my grandparents there. And so, my mother sang at the White House several times and stayed at the White House several times. And later on, she married my father. She introduced my father to the Roosevelts. My father was a rock rib Republican. And he took to them. They took to him. And so when I was born, and I have a picture I can show you, when I was born, my mother asked Eleanor if she would be my godmother. And Eleanor said, well, I'm really old, and, what good can I do? And my mother said, well, it will be an example. You will provide an example for my daughter to follow. So, so here, I hope you can see it. Here's the picture of her holding me in my,
what a treasure. What a treasure.
Yeah. And then, and I was lucky. She died when I was only 7 years old, but later, here's another picture to show you of me with her at,
there you go.
At Hyde Park. Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
Chris, what do you remember about Eleanor Roosevelt?
I remember she was very, very kind. I was, obviously when I was born, they were long out of the White House, and Franklin had passed away. But I did get to visit her at Hyde Park a couple of times and stay there. And it's funny because my mother was very proud, being raised an Austrian child, sort of, manners were very, very important. I had a very formal upbringing, and my mother was very, sure to teach me about how to eat properly at the table, and, and say please and thank you, and, be very polite. And my mother was always very proud that I was the only child allowed to eat with the adults. All the Roosevelt grandchildren were off eating in the kitchen, and I was sitting at the table because I knew how to, how to do that. And I just remember Eleanor. You could see from that picture how sweetly she looked at me, and I just remember her being very kind and generous. And, I know she was, and I have a stack of letters, she wrote lots of letters, and she wrote my mother all the time. So I have a stack of letters from her. And she, she died when I was very young. I didn't know her all that well, but, she was such an inspirational person, and so, so ahead of her time, really, I think. And so many of the little sayings, that she said, I think about and really like. She says, no one can make you feel inferior without your consent.
Yes.
And, always do something every day that scares you a little bit. Those kinds of things just really, they stay with me.
Certainly, certainly. Do you know if she was served as godmother to any other children?
I don't know. I don't know whether she did or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, how special.
What an interesting background.
Yeah,
Mm.
I feel very, very lucky.
Have you been able to share that in other venues or in communiques?
You mean about my
About your
I loved, I mean, I carry those pictures around in my phone. I have pictures of them. I love to share them with people, and because it's always it's always sort of a conversation starter, right? To
certainly.
talk about that.
Yes.
Um, my mother wrote a book about her life that she self-published. So congratulations, by the way, on your award, because I know
Thank
how
you.
hard that is. I know she wrote an autobiography really about what it was like, living in Austria, in the happy times and the bad times,
Mhm.
and about her journey here, and a lot about her relationship with the Roosevelts. And you mentioned that she was a radio journalist. Um, she didn't ever make it really. I mean, she did perform on Broadway, but she didn't really make it as a star that she wanted to be. And when she married my father and they moved to Wilmington, Delaware, where I was born, because my father had a job actually that the Roosevelts gave him during the war. Delaware was, and still is, a sort of farming state in the lower half of the state. And they farm soybeans, and they also farm chickens. And
Mm.
like all those Purdue chickens and all, they all come from Delaware. And my father got a job as sort of the commissioner to make sure that like an local agriculture commissioner, to make sure that the chickens that were supposed to go to the armed forces actually went there. So they moved to Wilmington, Delaware, and she didn't quite know what to do with her talent,
Mhm.
and decided, she went to the local radio station and said, I would like to do a radio program where I play international music and describe it to people. And she said, I'll sell the advertising. You don't have to pay me. I'll go and figure it out. And she did. And she started this program. It ran on Sunday evenings, and it became very popular. And then she pitched them on doing what you guys do, on doing an interview show, and a regular, every day for 10 or 15 minutes on the radio. She would interview people. She would do travel logs. She would do commentary on what was going on. And every play, the DuPont company is based in Wilmington, and so there's a
Oh,
beautiful playhouse there. And all of the sort of Broadway shows that were on the road would come, and she would, do interview the people who were there. So I got to meet lots of pretty famous people, because she was always interviewing the people that were coming through, doing these shows.
Yes.
And so that's the other thing that was very inspirational, was that she was an entrepreneur. She basically said, this is what I want to do, and she did it. And I've always taken from that if you want to do something, you just do it. So she wrote a book about all of that.
What is the title of the book, Chris?
It's called Thank You, America.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And her name as an author is what?
Charlotte Shedd is her name. My
Yes.
maiden name was Shedd, Shedd. So
Okay.
yeah.
Cool.
And it was something she just always wanted to tell, that story. And it's called Thank You, America, because even though she was very Austrian at heart, I mean, she was, totally Austrian. I mean, she cooked it, she did all kinds of interesting things. But she always was so grateful. She became a citizen the minute she could, and she was so grateful to America for saving her and giving her the opportunity, to do. And she felt like she saved her parents, because she sent them food packages, always, because they would have starved to death. They were not only under the Nazi, regime, but then after the war, when they divided Europe up and they divided Austria up, her family was unfortunately in the Russian zone, which was not a good place to be. And so she believed that she actually saved them too, by being an American and being able to send things to them.
We are blessed in this country, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
Yes.
You mentioned food. Do you continue to make traditional Austrian food?
Very much. Yeah, very much. I love cooking. My mother instilled in me a love of cooking.
Mhm.
And I love cooking, and I learned, all of the traditional foods, the Wiener Schnitzel and the Hungarian goulash and the
Mhm.
Sachertorte cake, and all of that stuff.
Mhm.
And I love making all of that.
Mhm.
And luckily, my husband John, who you've interviewed before, is a Slovak, and Slovakia was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So all of those foods are all, they're all the same.
Yeah.
They may have different names,
Mhm.
but they're all the same sort of traditional. So Hungarian paprikash and
Mhm.
all of the noodle dishes and all that kind of stuff. So
Yum.
I know I love cooking all that.
Chris,
So-
how did your mother influence you musically?
Well, we always had music playing in the house, because not only because she was a singer, but it was interesting. She would record her programs in our house. It was so funny because back in the 50s and the 60s, it was before we had all this kind of technology, right? But she had a recording studio in our house, and she would, on a big one, remember those giant tape recorders, those big reel to reels, she would have a reel to reel tape recorder in there and all kinds of equipment, and she would tape the programs, and then she would get in the car and drive the tape over to the radio station and give it to them, and she'd tape her own commercials and do all that kind of stuff. So
What a
we
gal.
very early on, we had speakers in the house, that would play music from her office. And because she had this international music show, there were music albums from all over the place in our house, and she would play that music at dinner. We would always have it, and she would take me also to, we were not all that far from Philadelphia, so we would go to the Philadelphia and also to New York to the Metropolitan Opera, and she
Cool.
took me to see performances of classical music. Primarily, she hated rock and roll. I mean,
Okay.
that was the thing. When rock and roll started, boy, I'm like, I want to watch the Beatles on TV. Oh no. um,
Poison yourself.
yeah, but so she, and so to this day, I love classical music, and we always go to the symphony. We just saw the Vienna Boys Choir 2 weeks ago. We went and saw the Vienna Boys Choir doing Christmas music, which was great. So,
Beautiful.
she influenced me to love classical music. Mozart is my absolute favorite composer, and have been to Europe to see where he was born, and been to many concerts of Mozart music. So really enjoyed that.
Would she explain about the masters of music to you, or how did you become infatuated with the music of Mozart?
I think it was by osmosis, really, just hearing it all the time, right?
Yeah.
From uh, uh, as long as I can remember, there was always music playing. And then she, loving Austria and missing Austria, she created a local Austrian American society, she called it.
Is that
And
right?
I mentioned, the DuPont company, and DuPont brought in engineers from all over the world to work there. And there were a lot of engineers that came from all of those countries in the empire, right? So, people from Austria and Hungary and the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Poland and, all those countries. And she created this society, and they all joined, and they would get together and they would cook the food and have dinners at each other's houses. And then she said, why don't we, being a musician, she said, why don't we sponsor a scholarship for a local Delaware musician to go and study in Austria? And there's a very famous, where my mother went and studied, there's a very famous school there, music school, called the Mozarteum, which is, everybody who is in Austria and around the world goes there and studies. And so she started this scholarship with the Austrian American Society, and they started putting on an annual Viennese ball. The
Ooh,
Viennese
cool.
where they would have a little orchestra come and play all of the Strauss waltzes and all of
Mm,
those, that
mm.
music. And it was formal. You had to wear, formal black tie or an Austrian costume. I have an Austrian dirndl, and John has an Austrian tuxedo. And, so you had to, if you didn't wear, I mean, my mother would like throw you out if you weren't in a long dress. She's like, I'd have to hold her back. She's like, that woman, I can see your ankles. And and so every year, of my life, I would go to this Austrian ball, and we would waltz, and we would polka, and we would chaudash, and we do all of that dancing. So, I think just, I just learned it that way, just from being around it all the time.
Right.
Do you remember any of her ball gowns?
Yeah, well, she, I could go and get a picture right now of her sitting in her Viennese, her Viennese outfit, but she usually would wear an Austrian dirndl, a formal dirndl. She had 2 or 3 of them.
Can you explain to us what that is?
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, it's a very Austrian costume. You wear an apron. And it's has a blouse underneath it, usually with puffy, a white blouse with puffy sleeves, and then sort of almost like a jumper kind of a dress, with a full skirt. And if it's formal, it's usually like satin or some sort of shiny material. And in Austria, people wear them on the street. I mean, it's a costume, but people would just as soon wear one of those, not a long one, but a short one,
Sure,
to work as they would, anything else. It's just Austrians are very, very traditional that way. So I usually would just wear a long dress. But then one year when John and I went to Austria, I bought myself a dirndl. Here, I can real quickly get you a picture.
yeah, that'd be fun.
Here's John and me dancing at this ball.
All right. Can you hold it a little closer, please?
Let's see.
There we go.
Closer.
Yeah, what a handsome couple.
There we are dancing. Yeah. That's before I got the dirndl, but yeah, so that was really a fun thing. Unfortunately, my mom passed away in 2009, and they did one more, but she was such a driving force in it that they just never continued doing it. And the people in the society, they were all getting older and older and older. And
right.
We were in California. We couldn't manage that thing from here, so it went away. But it was a great tradition.
Then the people of your generation who still lived out in that area, did they desire not to keep it going?
They did not. I think most of them, I think sometimes when you're a first generation, you want to assimilate, right? Your parents want you to assimilate. They don't necessarily. I think I was sort of an anomaly that, I kind of embraced that tradition. I mean, I'm also very American too, but I'm a little bit of an anomaly. In fact, the reason that John got a beautiful Austrian tuxedo is that one of the people who were in that society, who we were friends with, called us up one day and said, "Would you come over? We have something to give you." And because John had always admired this guy's tuxedo, it was just beautiful. If you think about the sort of green, the green with the bone buttons on it, it's very sort of, if you think about The Sound of Music and what the Baron always wore, it's like that.
Yeah.
And they gave John his tuxedo and said, "Our children aren't interested in it, and we want somebody to have it that will wear it and will love it." And he wears it still. He wore it to the Vienna Boys Choir. So
oh yeah, cool.
Chris, do you recall how your mother responded to seeing The Sound of Music?
Actually, what's interesting is my mother went to school with 2 of the Von Trapp children.
Oh,
they were in elementary school together, and one of them, Agatha. So there was a daughter, Maria. That all the names were different in the movie. They changed all the names.
okay.
The real name, there was an Agatha and a Maria. who went to school with my mother before they left, obviously, before they went over the mountain. And they came and they both moved to Vermont. Everybody moved to Vermont, right? The whole family lived in Vermont. And my mother kept up with them. And they came to the ball.
How?
And it was very exciting. You know, two of them, one year, both of them came, and another year, Maria came a couple times, and she stayed in our house, and they were just lovely people. So my mother, you know, the Sound of Music had, you know, it was the foundation of the story was very true. And, you know, there were obviously artistic embellishments to it, but, you know, but she loved it. And not the least of which is because she actually, you know, she actually knew them.
Right.
And I visited them. We went to the Trapp Family Lodge, John and I did, and Maria was living there. She passed away a few years ago, but she was living there, and we visited her, and we sat with her in her little house, and she played the accordion and sang for us, and it was really cool.
Yeah. So then, what did your have you seen the video Amadeus? And
it's my favorite movie.
I love it.
I watch it all the time. It's my absolute favorite movie.
Yeah. So did your mother have anything to say about that, or was she alive at that time when it came out? It was in the 80s that it came out.
Yeah, she was alive. I'm not sure if she saw it. I don't know if she would have liked it. You know, it's a little, you know, she was very proper, and he was far from proper in that movie.
Exactly right.
I'm not sure she would have liked it so much.
Off the
but I love it. I think it's great.
It's funny, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, so we're anything on your mind, Janine? Because I have some more questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So anyway, let's leave Vienna at this time and go back to Arden, and tell us about the 1950s and early 60s of your life. Now, whatever comes to your mind, please.
Well, you know, you mentioned in the intro, and I describe it as idyllic. I mean, it is. So you know, it's a very, very unique community. It was founded on an economic principle called the single tax. And Henry George was this economist, philosopher guy in the late 1800s, who believed that you should only be taxed. You should not be taxed on the fruits of your labor. You should just be taxed on what you own. And so all of the land in Arden is owned by the community. It's not owned individually. So we still own the house I grew up in Delaware. I don't own the land. The land is leased. It's a 99-year lease, and that you pay rent annually, which is your tax. And whether it's, you know, a gigantic house or a small house, it doesn't make any difference. They basically assess the value of that land. So if you're next to a busy road, it's not as highly valued as if you're next to the forest, which is nice and quiet. And so that was his philosophy. And the government of the town is run by town meeting. So it's a complete democracy. You know, they have trustees that sort of execute on things, but everything is done by a vote. So it can be a little bit messy sometimes. Yes. But it was also founded as really an art colony, kind of, which is nice because I live in Laguna Beach now, which is also a very artistic place. And so, my mom was drawn to it because of the artistic nature of it. And also because all of the houses are very unique, everything from cottages to Tudor style, you know, very sort of almost European looking. And so my mom was drawn to that when my parents were living in Wilmington, downtown Wilmington, which, you know, it's not that great of a city. And she found Arden and was like, no, we're living here. And she found the house that they moved into, and the people weren't, it wasn't even for sale, and she just badgered them into selling it to her. I don't know how she did that. But so it's beautiful because it's, you know, because it's very limited in development. They divided it up into these lots, and you mentioned we have village greens There are many village greens that are just big empty spaces with playgrounds on them, and
Oh, wonderful.
people, it's a great place to be. And then it's bordered on all sides, or like basically on three sides, by forest. And through the forest runs this beautiful creek. And my childhood was spent riding my bike around, because it's very safe. There's not speed limit everywhere is 20 miles an hour. So it's very safe. And playing on the green, going into the woods, playing, we had Shakespeare plays we would do in the woods and stuff, and hop. We called it hop rocking instead of rock hopping. We did hop rocking on the rocks in the creek, and so it was a wonderful wonderful place. And they also have a guild hall, so it's very English sort of looking. They have a guild hall where the community, and I think there's only like 400 families that live in this whole area. And they have what they call guilds, which are, groups of people that do special interest things. So there's a Shakespeare guild that puts on Shakespeare plays. There's a folk dancing guild. There's a poets guild where they read poetry, a scholars guild where they talk about philosophy. There's all kinds of different special interest groups that you can join. They have a dinner guild where every Saturday people put on dinner for the whole town, and the whole town shows up. So it was just a really unique, beautiful place to be.
Very, very idyllic. And there are about 400 people, families there, and there's no room for anyone else to enter. Is that right?
Right. So, somebody leaves and, somebody else can come in. My house is rented out because we live here, obviously, but, I couldn't bear to, I'm actually about to sell it, but I couldn't bear to, when my mom passed away and left it to me, and, it was I just couldn't bear to part with it. Even now when we go back, there's a little cottage that we rent so that we can, go look at our house and hang out there. And even now when I walk, I haven't lived there in, 40 years, 50 years. But when I walk around, people stop me and, hi, how are you doing? And, it's just it's a lovely community.
Oh, yeah.
When was the last new home constructed there?
Every once in a while, somebody will, one of the houses, because they're all old. Like our house is 110 years old, I think. It was one of the first. Ours is one of the first houses in Arden, and every once in a while, one of them falls down and they build a new one. But they're all, even when they build a new house, it looks old. So
sure.
There's no, you can petition to build, like we have 3/4 of an acre. So technically we could build another house on that property, but you'd have to go through, all kinds of rigmarole to get that done. And people don't want to do it. People live there because they like the way it is. It's a very traditional kind of place.
Does the school system promote the arts then for its students?
We had a school there. Arden had its own school. And actually, it was the first integrated school in Delaware. So Delaware was right on the Mason-Dixon line, and and it had a lot of segregation, and there were slaves. It was a sort of quasi-slave state, and we had a little school. I didn't go to it. I went to a Quaker school, the Wilmington Friends School. I went to, but Arden had its own primary school. It was the first integrated school in Delaware, and they were very focused on the arts, but that school, it's probably hasn't been around since the 70s. I would say it closed, and people went to the neighboring public schools around. But that guild hall that I talked about is very focused. They have programs for kids to do different kinds of arts and crafts and all kinds of things. So there's a painters guild, and there's a craft guild, and there's a jewelers guild. And every year they have a big fair for a day. The whole town participates in the Arden Fair. It's been going on for almost 100 years. And everybody sells their wares there, and they They have music, and people come from all over the place. I mean, hundreds
Yeah.
and thousands of people come to this fair, and
I'd
that's
love to go there.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's really fun. We went a couple years ago again.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
Chris, we're getting near to the end of our fun chat, but there's so much more we could discuss and learn from you. But I'd like to ask people, think of a fun memory of the 1950s.
Well, the 1950s are a little hard because I was only
Sure.
4 or 5 years old. I think my really fun memories are really of my youth in Arden, in those early days. I mean, just the freedom to be able to, to go out and play. I mean, I look at kids now and how supervised they are, and how,
Yes.
every minute is either being supervised or they're looking at a screen or something.
Yes.
And living where I lived, we would be out playing all day, and it was small enough where, our sort of little area where we played was small enough that when it was time for dinner, my mother would like ring a bell, right? And it's like, oh, time to go home for dinner.
Yep.
And then you go out and play again until it was dark, and I think that's my fondest memory really is just that freedom and being able to just, go out and have a good time and, make stuff up and be with your friends.
Right.
That word in all of our conversations we've had, people have mentioned freedom the most. That's the word, the freedom of the 50s to be kids safely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Viewers, we are so thankful that you joined us today. Yeah, we hope that you learned a lot about the 1950s from our guest this week, Christobel Selecky, originally from Arden, Delaware, and now living in Laguna Beach, California. Chris, we do thank you so much for joining us and sharing about your life in the 50s and really your mother's life prior to that, and even past the 1950s. And of course, we know that the 1950s was very influential in many of our lives, even if we didn't spend a lot of years in that decade.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for joining us. We are just so grateful for the opportunity to hear from you today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Viewers, next time we will have another guest on our 1950s Fun Chat whose story will help broaden your knowledge of the 1950s. And we don't only try to just broaden your knowledge, but we do want to expose you to the very genuine people who lived in that decade. And really, some of us are still alive to be able to share that information. And so that's what makes it fun. And we hope that you get on the bandwagon and join us and listen to many of these fun chats that we have recorded. Chris's number 70, I believe it is, of the fun chats that we do. And so each week we have a great opportunity for you to learn more about the 1950s. Jackie, how would you like to close our program today?
I would like to close by reminding people, just go to our website, www.wildthewindmill.watched, and you can click on Fun Chats and see all of them that we've recorded. Look at part of them, look at all of them, whatever. It's just a very educational grouping of videos. But also, please look at below this screen. You see the red subscribe button, so please touch that. And also the blue thumbs up button. So we thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Toodaloo.